Andreas Tijerina, take one.
Are we good?
We're good. Rock on.
Okay, so the first thing I got to do, I got to keep in my mind that you're doing this interview not under duress, and I've asked you to do this, and you've kindly accepted, and this is okay with you.
Yes.
Okay, so I did have a chance to tell you, but this means, I'm sure, a lot more to me than it means to you. And I really appreciate you taking the time to do this. And I said, take the questions wherever you want to go. One of the things I'm trying to do, because in my interviews, a lot of times the interviews are an hour and a half, and then people get mad because you use 2 seconds of their interview. I don't think that's going to be the case with you. But there's a couple things I want to read, and I'm thinking of like vignettes. At one point I said to Frank, what do you think you could do? I got a question for you. Can you do it in 2 minutes? Or 3 minutes or something like that, because some of these questions you could probably talk a whole day. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off and read an abstract of my article, and open to critique. This is where I'm going. I just wanted you to know the direction I'm going to. So I'm going to read this and ask for what you think about it, and we have some questions. So here's my abstract. The El Paso massacre, the deadliest Latinx massacre in U.S. history, was also the deadliest white supremacist attack in the United States in more than 50 years. The assassin is a GoPro.
Yeah. Pain in the butt. Not cooperating today.
Yeah, you were really one of the interviews I was really looking for. I think if I didn't get the interview, I'd been kind of ticked off. And I said, and I got a little money from LULAC to do it, and I told them, I said, everybody knows about racism against African Americans, and I didn't quite say this, but I said, I think you guys got to step up your game a little bit. And there was a guy, I don't know if you know, David Cruz, he's out there, and he was rude to me, and I'm not a rude person, but I just called him up. He's in charge of, what am I talking, media.
You can go ahead, Jack.
Okay, okay, okay. Should I just start where I was?
Yeah, just start
Okay,
where
all right, so I'm just...
on you eventually.
Okay, so the El Paso massacre, the deadliest Latinx massacre in U.S. history, was also the deadliest white supremacist attack in the United States in more than 50 years. The assassin, Patrick Cruces, told the police that he came to El Paso to kill Mexicans. In the immediate aftermath of the killings, Texas Governor Greg Abbott and his Republican colleagues have been tenacious in their efforts not only to whitewash the El Paso massacre, but the entirety of Texas's dark history of slavery, racism, and violence against Latinos. The repudiation of the 1619 Project, the creation of the 1836 Project, and the fierce resistance to teaching critical race theory are indicative of attempts to whitewash history. There are several significant points argued in the essay. The El Paso tragedy was not an aberration. It is the deplorable culmination of more than 2 centuries of white supremacist ideology's growth in the state of Texas. Anglo-racism against Latinos may be found in the very first contact between Anglos and Mexicans in Tejas. The recent atrocities at the U.S.-Mexican border have deep roots in the genocide of Native Americans and in the slavery of African Americans.
I wouldn't limit it to Anglo-Americans, Anglo-Saxon, because Spaniards did the same thing to the natives in their period when they were here. And while this airplane's going over, let me go ahead and mention to you that I just met a gentleman who's setting up a sort of a PBS for Latinx International. It is literally a PBS for Latinx, but it covers Europe and Latin America and Mexico, and he's from Chicago, so it covers US. He would be very interested in what you're doing. So when we get through, let's talk about that.
Okay.
Because you've got an international network that you might be able to put it on.
Yeah. While we're doing this, I do global peace. When I say, I was just telling Frank, I went to The Hague and I got to go into the palace, and I interviewed a whole bunch of scholars that live in zones of conflict. So it's not just people that are experts, but Palestine, Israel, Northern Ireland, the whole lot. And I filmed nonstop about 7-8 hours a day for 3 days in a row. And my program's called the Global Consortium for Sustainable Peace. So we try to use education as the way for linking. But I've interviewed some of the greatest peace, mostly women, peace builders in Northern Ireland, and connections all over the world. Turkey, Jim and I did 17 what are called live streams in Turkey and Israel and Palestine and things like that. So yeah, I have a pretty good global connection and all that stuff. So,
you want to continue, or do you want to, now the airplane's gone?
Yeah, just go ahead and start when I get. Actually, 2 seconds. Reset. Let me just use the other one. I don't know why that one's giving me such grief.
Yeah, I probably, and this isn't a lie, I probably studied 1,000 hours the first time I've interviewed Chomsky, and the second time I brought my daughter to MIT. She was in college, and she got I said, "You're going to ask Chomsky 3 or 4 questions," and at the end, I guess Chomsky had a granddaughter named Emma. My eldest is Emma, and he patted her on the head. He said, "Oh my God, Dad, Chomsky patted me on the head." You know, she was all thrilled because she was in her language, speech and language pathology. So she
be a highlight of her professional career.
Yeah, so we were just sitting in. We're just sitting in his office in MIT, and all the camera. I sent that all the way. It was back to everybody was watching at my college, and at first it was like one of those things where nobody. I'm getting back. We can't see it at Cerritos College, and then the whole place. But we just hit rebooted it. Boom! You're there. It was just in his office doing that. So, all right.
Everything's copacetic.
Okay. So anyway, getting back to that, you said it's not just about Anglo-Saxon.
No, the Anglos are not the only ones that are racist. That whole concept that the Europeans coming over to what they called the New World, it presupposes that they thought they were the only important people, or even the only humans, full humans in the world, that they had developed through centuries. One of the things that I focus for Hispanic or Mexican American history, Tejano history, is that for 800 years the Christians in Spain, the Iberian Peninsula, had been conquered by Muslims. And so they, in 800 years, developed a very definite, strong, intolerant view of anything but a Christian,
right?
Anything but a Roman Catholic. And the Muslims taught them that when you fight to the end and to the death. There's no prisoners. You behead any prisoners at the end of a battle.
It's like the degüello?
Exactly. That's where it came from.
Right.
That's where the degüello came from. And that's the word. The really bad words in Mexico are really Arab words that the Muslims brought to Spain, that the Spaniards, and the bad concepts came with them.
Mm-hmm.
So when the Spaniards then came and brought those same methods that they used to defeat the Muslims, they brought those same methods to Spain, to Mexico. They call it New Spain. And they implemented that brutality and that perspective that they are the only real human beings. You cannot go to heaven unless you're a Catholic, Roman Catholic Christian. And you're not even a human being until the Pope finally declared, okay, I just figured it out, that the natives of Mexico are humans and they have a soul. Like it's some sort of an epiphany or something. But until then, the Spaniards considered them not to be human, not to have a soul.
Mm-hmm.
So that perspective then was appropriated by the British, the Dutch, and the French, and all the other Europeans who, after Columbus, wanted to come in and cash in on the New World. Mm-hmm. They wanted the gold, they wanted the tobacco, they wanted the sugar, they wanted everything else. And so they brought those same attitudes. The British people, on the eve of colonization, had by that time already developed a great intolerance to religion. Mm-hmm. They were already Catholic and beheading Catholics and Protestants back and forth. Ireland is one of the most brutal experiences.
Absolutely.
Where they literally beheaded the Irish Catholics and put their heads up on a stake. And their way of saying was, kill them all, every man, woman, and child. That was Sir Humphrey Gilbert. And Humphrey Gilbert's the same one, remember, that brought Roanoke. So when they come to Roanoke, they've got that experience. These are not humans. Mm-hmm. Kill them all, every man, woman, and child. And so the Anglo-American development of that idea just was retained. They changed it by the time it was Native Americans in the 1860s, 1870s to a statement that was kill the babies, nits make lice. And so their whole concept was you must exterminate.
Absolutely.
And I didn't use these terms, but basically what I'm trying to tell you is that what you see later in the 1800s, what Santa Anna did at the Alamo, killing every single one of them. What the Anglo-Texans did at San Jacinto when you got about 1,500 military soldiers in uniform under the International Uniform Code of Military Justice, they surrender, they put their weapons down, they're in uniform, they have a flag, they represent a country that sent them to fight a war. You don't slaughter them, they've surrendered. The Anglo-Texans slaughtered them, every single one of them. They said, bash their brains in, boys. That was their statement. And so these concepts they're just repeated all the way through. It didn't start with Anglo-Americans in 1836.
Sure. Let me ask you this, though. I mean, you do so much work, and we as scholars in history is so broad, we have to, I wrote about Caesar Rodney, who was the leader of the revolution in Delaware. And I wrote about him because he could bring Whigs and Tories together when things were so divisive. We have to choose a topic. So I totally agree with you, and I think it's great to see you outline the antecedents here. This didn't begin, right? You're taking us back in time. But if I'm just saying for the sake of argument that, a lot of people in Texas said, hey, this El Paso massacre is an aberration. People that are lone wolves, or people watching too many video games, so I think in the focus that I had, I was just say, okay, let's rewind the tape and see if we can go back to an earlier time. Am I correct in saying, and I'm thinking here, they called them greasers, that you can see that racism in the very beginning, the land grants of 1820s, in the 1830s through the Alamo, and then the Mexican-American War through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's where it is very clearly manifested. Not only manifested in the actions, the battles, the conflicts, after the Anglo-Americans came into Texas in 1821, but it is very explicitly articulated. It's articulated at the local level by the people who are here. It's articulated at the broader level by the immigrant move that is coming in with Stephen F. Austin. And it's articulated at the national level, where you have national leaders like Senator John C. Calhoun, who was willing to take all of Mexico after the U.S.-Mexico War. And he said, except for the problem that if you take them, you're going to have to kill half of them, because they're a half Indian and mongrel, half Indian, half Spaniard. So you can't take all of Mexico. So it'd be too much trouble and too much cost to kill that many millions of people.
It's almost like a reverse racism. I've talked about that a lot, where you look at somebody like Calhoun, as you say, when you first look at it, he's almost like, benevolent. He's not going to take all of Mexico, until you finish the sentence and realize that we don't want all these mongrels being treated as equals in the United States. And if there's one word that I found in reading, the diaries of the Texans, the letters, the history, the publication, without a doubt, I mean, I haven't counted the number, this is anecdotally, but the one word that comes out is mongrel. I hear mongrel. Who are these mongrels? Who are they? Are they Spanish? Are they Native American? Are they Tejano? Are they African American? Are they a blend? And you quickly see in that period, the 1830s or 1840s, almost that justification. I can remember Sam Houston saying, "We will not apologize for taking all the land from these mongrels," and then going on to say, in almost a defensive mode, not an offensive, we're not ashamed of taking this land, because these people, right, these mixed people, these mongrels, do not embrace Anglo-Saxonism. They forfeited the right to the land, And it's almost this racist justification. And I kind of mentioned with respect to Reginald Horseman, you know, in his Manifest Destiny, it was something relatively new. I mean, we all throw out like Manifest Destiny, but in his one chapter, he's talking about almost how Manifest Destiny and Anglo-Saxon white supremacy kind of mingle. And what he does in the book, you know, is he kind of talks about the evolution, like maybe in the 1810s, 1820s, when he talks about Anglo-Saxonism, he's talking about colonialism and Anglo-Saxon laws, some more positive, you know, things. And then he says you see this transition to something that this racism was absolutely horrible, that it wasn't what it used to be. And then what he does is he looks at actual historical events, so whether it's, you know, the Battle of Alamo or Goliad or the Mexican-American War, where you start seeing this being utilized. And I was talking to Frank, because it was new to me, I didn't realize that Manifest Destiny, when it was coined, didn't really take off. It was not a hot word.
Not until 1845, around that time, it was in a national newspaper, the National Review, that finally it began to, it was articulated using those terms, and that then became the rhetoric.
Right.
Manifest Destiny.
Right. And it was kind of interesting that what Horseman talks about, this kind of racial hierarchy that was started to be constructed. And he says it's this racism, virulent racism that he chronicles in the 1830s and 1840s. And he starts to see this transition away from the old version of what Anglo-Saxonism meant to something different. And you start to see the racial hierarchy. And then we were talking a little bit more that one thing that really hit me with all these so-called Texians was, I'd call it a fascination and even an obsession with color. One of the things that Frank said to me, which enlightened me, and it's not something I thought, he said in a time with no photographs, people had to be very explicit when they were talking about, well, I met Andreas today, and what was he like in his features? But I've never seen the description of cinnamon, gold, copper, jet black, and there's a real preoccupation with the mixture of blood as a justification why why would Anglo-Saxons ever surrender themselves to anybody who was of the Mongol race?
Yeah, and that concept of being a mongrel race is just one term, mongrel. They use the term miscegenation, and as you say, this whole definition of these definite colors that they had to have scales. So race was definitely one of the most important criteria in their mind. Now, they didn't think of it as a criterion or anything, but it was one of the most important things that they saw when they identified somebody. You identify on the basis first of race. But there were other tenets that Horseman points out. Religion, democracy, education, other characteristics like that. And they saw, it's not just the aberration. It's the idea that every one of those concepts that Horseman points out, every one of those tenets, is a direct contradiction. Mm-hmm. The contradiction that the Mexicans are not prepared to govern themselves, an absolute contradiction, because the Tejanos already had a democracy established. And it was sine qua non. Without that democracy, you couldn't have invited the Anglos. That's the only reason that Stephen F. Austin was invited, because they had a constitutional democracy established. So every one of those tenets, race, religion, democracy, whatever, liberty, bringing liberty to Texas, bringing freedom into, and we still celebrate it, March 2nd, when they brought liberty to Texas. How do you bring liberty when 2/3 of the population, definitely 1/3, but in most places, in particular East Texas, is enslaved? They brought slavery to Texas. And so for them to say that they brought liberty to Texas, that they brought a constitutional democracy to Texas, every one of those tenets that they cite to justify Manifest Destiny or taking over Texas from the Anglos is a contradiction. You were talking a while ago about Was the American Revolution a revolution, or was it independence? Well, one of the criteria that you use is that set of criteria that we get from Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Voltaire, The Social Contract by Rousseau, John Locke. The social contract presupposes that the people have a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, or what property, whatever. And that if the administration does not serve those purposes and instead abuses them through a long train of abuses, that it's the right of the people to overthrow that government and to establish in its place a better government that will serve the people. Now the question is, when the government of Texas was overthrown in 1836, was it the people of Texas that overthrew the government? Or was it the people of Tennessee and Alabama and Kentucky that overthrew this government? Who overthrew this government? Was it the people? Or was it people that came in illegally and not only were not Mexicans, but detested Mexico and Mexicans? Who overthrew the government of Texas? If it was outsiders that came in and overthrew the government and took over the land, that's not a revolution.
Right.
That's simply a land grab.
Right.
And so revolution, liberty, government, democracy, all of these tenets, they're not just aberrations, they're contradictions.
Right. It's an interesting part when you look at concepts like liberty or freedom, what those concepts mean. And when you start to see these people come in, I think that's what really moved me about your work. And I can say that, you really talk about the achievements of Tejano. So one of the questions I've been really dying to ask you, did you invent the term Tejano?
I was the first one to use it, copyright it. My dissertation was so widely spread that actually I was a division director, a group manager with Motorola Semiconductor. I finished my dissertation, and instead of going into writing books, I directed a state agency for Texas, and then I was a director of a division for Motorola Semiconductor, and not writing books or doing history at all. But I kept getting all of these calls, like your call. We want to talk to you about your dissertation. So many people were using my dissertation. It was coming up in books. Historians were interviewing me. But one day my wife called me and said, you need to come over to the Texas State Historical Association meeting right now. They're having all of their sessions and their seminars, and they're arguing about you right now. And I said, well, I'm at work over here in a corporation. I'm a corporate work, right? And she said, so I went over to this, and they were discussing, well, Tijerina meant this, and Tijerina meant that. Finally, one of them says, well, he's right here, ask him. And that's when the wife said, you need to publish your dissertation.
Mm-hmm.
This is a clear sign.
Mm-hmm.
So my dissertation, Tejanos and Texas, the native Mexicans of Texas,
Mm-hmm.
is the first time that it was copyrighted and widely used by the historians that were publishing books. So they were using the word Tejano from my dissertation. And then when I published it as a book, it won the American Library Association Book Choice Award. It won a couple of other national awards, prizes. And so by that time, the word Tejano began to be used. And at the time, I was arguing the whole time, we need to quit calling these people Mexicans. They are Texans. The people who started the Texas Revolution, the only legitimate people. A while ago I said, a guy from Tennessee cannot come overthrow the government of Texas and claim it's the people of Texas. But if a Tejano overthrows the government of Texas, that's a legitimate revolution. So the Tejanos were the only people that gave the Texas Revolution legitimacy as a revolution. Anybody else is just a land grab. So I began to realize, why are we talking about Mexicans? Why don't we talk about Tejanos? They're the legitimacy. And they're the people who really established Texas as a European-style government.
Mm-hmm.
So Tejano, to me, was the most important thing. I came to the University of Texas. I had a 4.0 at Texas Tech for my master's. I got a thesis, master's in 12 months at Texas Tech. And when I got here to UT, up for my doctorate, I told the graduate advisor, he asked me, what do you want to study? I said, Tejano history. He says, you can't. And I said, why not? He says, there's no such thing. And I said, no. I'm talking about a history of the people. He says, what people? I said, the Tejanos. He says, there's no such thing. You can't write a history of something that doesn't exist. And I said, what about the Mexican American? He says, they don't exist. And I said, really? What are they? He says, they're all Americans. I said, really? I needed you to tell the teachers when I was a kid and they said I couldn't go to school because I wasn't American. I needed you to tell them that, not me. So you want me to study American history? I got my PhD at UT in American history because they wouldn't let me study Tejano history.
That's amazing.
Okay, but once my book came out and it won the top awards in Texas and a couple of them in the national level as well, then people began to use it. The big difference to me was when a whole cadre, a whole cohort of PhD historians begins to develop across the state and around the country that are studying Tejano history. We have now more books on Tejano history, and they're the awards, Monica Martinez, they're the ones that are winning the awards now. And they're not winning them because of, affirmative action, political. They're winning them because these are the best history books, the best scholarly books that are being written, and they're all Tejano. So, I certainly associate with the word Tejano.
I have to tell you, I have 3 shelves at home on Tejano history, and that's not it was something that, your work really influenced me among other Tejano historians. And my wife would say, my God, how many books did you order? So 5 books are left on the front porch, and I'm starting to read through all that stuff.
That is my dream come true. That's
right.
my wish come true.
And one of the things, I had this question, it's funny, it's a very nice segue that you gave us. It's a question, and you kind of answered a little bit, but there's a couple things. I said, in your book, Tejanos in Texas Under the Mexican Flag, you documented the reverse flow of Tejano contributions and influence to Anglo culture while Anglos and Mexicans existed under the Mexican flag, which I think is a very unique. You think of that culture going in one direction, which it didn't, and you talk about that reverse flow. Can you talk a little bit about that Tejano influence? And I think that goes along with the idea, which is kind of another question, that many historians of Texas have marginalized the contributions and significance of Tejanos in Texas history. Now, I think one thing, I watched you in a video, you got very animated. I got animated watching you get animated about all the contributions, and I wrote some of those down. You talked a little bit about democracy and water rights and constitutionalism and some of the cultural things. So you think about Texas with the Longhorns and the Mustangs and all that stuff. Can you talk a little bit about the reverse flow of culture that you were talking about that often gets left out?
Sure. I think you have to unlearn what you've been taught about Texas history, Tejano history, American history. You have to unlearn a big part of it before you can learn the facts. And just to give you a sort of a perspective of that, let me point out that it was the Mexicans, not Aztecs. They called themselves Mexica.
Sure.
The Spaniards and other people call them Aztecs, who took a weed, and through hundreds of years, the Maya, the Olmec, the Mexican, the Aztecs, developed from a weed that was no taller than about maybe 2 feet high, that had a little bit of grain on it. They hybrided it intentionally. They're horticulturalists. Hybrided it. It was called Tecentli. They hybrided it until the grain was this long. The stalk was 8 feet high, and it was nutritious. It could be grown in almost any climate, any temperature, several times a year, and it provided hominy, corn on the cob, you name it. They gave us corn from nature. They did the same thing with the pineapple, the pumpkin, the chocolate, vanilla, medical medicines that they gave us, the tomato, the potato, you name it.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, we call it Indian corn, Italian chocolate, Dutch chocolate, Italian tomatoes, Irish potatoes, French vanilla. What's wrong with this picture? The Europeans have made us all think of everything that the natives did as just completely silenced and rebranded as a European product. And before you can even talk about what Tejanos gave us, you have to understand that there's this reverse, it's not the reverse flow, that's true, or the Tejanos taught the Anglos. But you have to also think from the Anglo-American, the Europeanized point of view, that they are the ones who reverse everything.
Mm-hmm.
They come in, they slaughter millions of Native Americans, and the only painting you have is 2,000 Native Americans killing poor little old Custer. They reverse the image. Oh, the Indians slaughtered the whites. The Mexicans slaughtered David Crockett and the boys at the Alamo. They never talk about the hundreds, the thousands of Mexicans that they slaughtered. And so you have to first understand it's a reversal. Now, what the Tejanos did, definitely there's all kinds of documentation. As I said in the first place, the Tejanos taught the Anglo-Americans about a real true frontier. A true frontier is when the people come to defend the frontier and they are rewarded for the frontier. The first thing that I'll say the Tejanos taught the Anglo-American is you don't sell land as a commodity. Land is a reward to someone who has sacrificed his life. He left his home and came to fight on the frontier to defend the rest of the nation out on the frontier. You give him land in perpetuity, no taxes. That is a totally different concept from the Anglo-Saxon legal tradition, where you have a distinct parcel of land that is sold as a commodity and can be resold. A Tejano does not resell his land. A Spaniard didn't resell his land because the land belongs to the family in perpetuity. It is conjoined with entail and those properties, those legal devices that encumber the land to the family and only the family. And so that's the first thing that I'll say Tejanos taught the Anglo-American, and that is what brought the Anglo-American. The people in Alabama were going broke with the tariffs and all the other problems. We're talking about John C. Calhoun writing the exposition.
And protest.
Exactly. They're protesting the fact that hundreds of thousands of Anglo-American cotton farmers are being driven out, and that's what's pushing them westward toward the new Louisiana Purchase, Missouri, the Kansas area, where they were moving. But when these people that are broke hear that in Texas you have not only the most fertile soil, the Blackland Prairie, which extends from San Antonio up to about the Dallas area, one of the most fertile tracts of soil, black soil, just below the Balcones Escarpment, for cotton, and perfect climate for cotton, and that you can get 4,428 acres free forever. A second principle is that it's a homestead, it cannot be taken from you for debt, no taxes. A third principle is that if it's in the wife's name, the wife owns as much of it as the man knows. So you have a free land grant. You have the concept of a homestead principle, that it can't be taken from you for taxes or anything else. For loans, you can owe money, they cannot take it from you. And then that the wife owns half of it through community property, another basic Tejano principle written here in San Antonio in Spanish by a Tejano. And that land not only belongs to the woman as much as to the man, that even if the man is in debt, you can't take it from the woman because she owns it too.
Right.
So you have community property. And understand that your grandmother didn't have a bank account. She couldn't. Because under legal Anglo-Saxon legal tradition, a woman in marriage does no longer exist. She is now et ux. She can't own a home, she can't own a bank account, a business, she can't vote. Under Anglo-Saxon legal, under the Spanish tradition, a woman owns anything the man owns. Probably your own mother, my mother, couldn't have a bank account or a credit card because a checking account, because women could not have bank accounts till, you know, maybe the 1930s, 40s, 50s, something like that. They started, and only because they adopted all of these Tejano principles. The concept that land in Texas belongs to Texas. The public domain. Now, Texas, I just explained to you, you can start going to California from Texas, but the halfway point to California, you're still in Texas. Texas is a large tract of land. And out of the 50 states, that large state is the only one that owns its own land. Washington owns Alaska. Washington owns public domain in California, New York. Nobody owns the land in Texas but Texas. Tejano said when they became part of the Mexican Republic, they said, we'll become part of your new republic in 1821, but we own the public domain and you can never have it. So the Tejanos established the principle that when Anglo-Americans got here and they finally took over Texas, they told Washington, D.C., oh, no. You don't own Texas. We do. That's a major Supreme Court case in Texas in 1951. It was Texas versus United States, where Texas got to claim, we own the public domain. And better than that, Tejano said, it's not the dirt, it's the subsoil minerals. Now they were thinking sulfur, salt, but a subsoil mineral is also petroleum. And when Texas began to realize the value of petroleum, they reminded the United States, by the way, the old Mexican law that we live under, and it was the Texas governor who said, Texas has always been a Mexican state. Really? I never heard that expression until they wanted the oil. So by claiming the subsoil minerals, thanks to the Tejano law, Texas is now one of the and has always been one of the wealthiest states. The petrochemical industry of the world, Houston, Texas, because of those principles. And then when the United States tried to tap the oil out in the Gulf of Mexico, they said, look, these oil wells can be taxed by the United States because they're out in the Gulf of Mexico. That's national waters. Texas says, no. Under Tejano law, we go 3 leagues into the ocean, not 3 miles. A league is 4 miles. We go like 10.5 something, 3.5 miles something. So we go about like 9 or 10 miles into the ocean. All that Gulf, that belongs to Texas. That's oil under the Gulf belongs. So you have all these principles.
What about water rights? Is it contribution that the Tejano ideas of water rights were?
The Arabs in northern Africa that came into Spain brought in the principle, you can hate a guy, you can behead the guy, but you don't deny him water, okay? Here in the desert, water is it. So the Spaniards picked up that concept that water belongs to everybody. You cannot deny a person water. And so when they got here, they brought their doctrine of prior appropriation, their concept that whoever uses water has a right to that water, has an ownership of that water. And he cannot deny it to anybody else, and he cannot be denied that water. So for example, here in Austin, the Colorado River runs through Austin, but Bastrop was established prior to Austin. So once Bastrop was using the water of the Colorado River to water their fields, Austin cannot cut off that water and deny Bastrop the water that they appropriated prior to Austin. Also, the water that flows through any river belongs to all of the people. So if you're a landowner on the banks of the Colorado, you can own the land on the banks, but you don't own the water flowing through the river, even if it's on your land. Anybody in Texas can come on a tube or a canoe and go through your land on that water.
So they don't have riparian rights on the...
They did not adopt English Anglo-Saxon riparian rights. We have adopted many of them, but for the most part, Anglo-American lawyers have to learn Mexican words, because if they're going to fight and win the biggest thing in Texas, even bigger than petroleum, we're going to find out pretty quick, is water.
Sure.
And so if you want to argue these big cases on water, you have to know Mexican law. You have to know Tejano law. So you tell me what is the impact of Tejano laws on modern Texas? I'll tell you what it is. And this is not even the culture. That's not even the huevos rancheros and the tamales and enchiladas.
Barbacoa.
And I'm talking about the basic principles of life and government of society. You cannot have Texas without Tejanos. The Tejanos established Texas. And you talk about a reverse flow. Well, there was a direct flow, but a reverse flow presupposes the fact that there is a direct flow. We know, and American history and Texas history has taught us what the Anglo-American brought. They're fond of saying, well, the Anglo-American brought constitutional democracy to Texas. They brought modern technology. Well, they did. They brought technology. They brought capitalism. They brought the American industrial market economy. They brought that. That's true. And the Tejanos wanted that. But they did get all of the rest of it back in these Tejano laws and principles. Yeah. It is an exchange. There were battles. Alamo, San Jacinto, and there was conflict. There is racial conflict. There was racial conflict.
One of the things I picked up in your video, which most people don't cover at all, can you quickly give us just an overview of the Battle of Medina and why the Battle of Medina is important?
Well, when I said that Tejanos already had democracy and that Anglo-American immigration to Texas presupposed the fact that Tejanos already had a constitution, it's much more than that. Remember, Tejanos are distinguished from Anglo-Americans in the fact that they are Hispanic. They're Mexican. But they're also distinguished from Mexicans in the fact that they were on the frontier for 100, 150 years. They got here to Texas in the late 1600s, and they started living here. They started establishing their own life. Now, they were Spaniards at the time. They paid taxes to the King of Spain. They were loyal to the King of Spain. And the Camino Real of the King of Spain came all the way through Texas, the road, and that road was for censuses to count how many Tejanos are there and how much can we tax every one of you. The king wanted his little bit as well. But those Tejanos were among the earliest Mexicans to begin to be converted into radical liberals. They read
the
Rousseau.
Enlightenment.
They had libraries here where they read Voltaire, Rousseau, John Locke. They had them. Anglo-Americans would come and they were amazed at the libraries that they found here. They were amazed at the libraries of the Tejano leaders that they found. These people, Tejanos, were reading, and they were becoming very committed to a new form of government. So when Napoleon invaded Spain and he took control of the Spanish government, at that point, because the Spanish government had to flee the actual parliament, which they called Cortes, had to flee Napoleon, and they had to restructure. It was local people from here around Texas, Coahuila, Texas, that restructured the Spanish empire, the Spanish imperial government during that period. And one of the things they said was, all provinces of the Spanish Empire will have elective governments. They established democracy. Texas, the Tejanos, were the first, some of the first ones in all of the Mexican provinces to establish a provincial deputation, which is like a state government. It's the first form of state government after the monarchy. They did that back in before the actual Mexican Revolution. The Mexican Revolution began, independence movement began in 1810.
Father Hidalgo?
Father Hidalgo declared it in 1810. By that time, Tejanos were already bitterly opposed to the provinces of Spain, the governments of Spain, and the provisions of the Spanish government. So when Mexico and Hidalgo began their independence movement and the war, the actual war for independence by Hidalgo in 1810, Hidalgo was captured very quickly. He was a priest, not a general. He was captured. He was on his way to Texas because he knew that Texas was a hotbed of liberal democracy. And he knew that these Tejanos were very different from other Mexicans. They were very anglicized, for one thing. All the Mexicans knew that. And the Tejanos were very aggressive people. living on the frontier for over 100 years, they had to fight Comanche and other hostile native tribes. They had to fight Anglo-American cattle rustlers, French, all kinds of invasion.
Hidalgo knew where he was going.
Oh, he knew where he was going. And before he was captured and executed by the Spanish government, just south of the border, he met a Tejano named Gutierrez de Lara. And Bernardo Gutierrez de Lara was already militarized when he met Hidalgo. Hidalgo commissioned him as a colonel. And so he ordered, with a commission, he said, take up the Revolutionary War. So Gutierrez de Lara went up and met with Madison, met with the president, met with the United States government and congressmen, lived in Philadelphia and New York, and they promised him help. They did give him help. And so he came back to Texas and formed an army in New Orleans and came into Texas in 1813 with his army of independence. He recruited Anglo-Americans, most of them who really just wanted land, but he told them, look, you help us win this revolution, we'll give you land. He recruited Native Americans, and he had all of his Tejanos as well. So in 1813, they marched into Nacogdoches, they marched into San Antonio, and in San Antonio, he published and printed a Constitution and a Declaration of Independence before any other state in Mexico did. So Texas had the first declaration, the first printed. We had an Anglo-American who lived here, he had a printer, he printed the Constitution under Gutierrez de Lara in 1813. Now Gutierrez de Lara then was invaded by a Spanish army under a man named Arredondo. And Arredondo, Joaquin de Arredondo, was brought up in the Spanish style of no prisoners. So he ambushed these about, I'd say 12 or 1,300 Tejano in their Tejano liberal army. And he had an army of, I don't know, 2,000 or 3,000, very well equipped, formal soldiers, uniforms, cannon, artillery, rifles, cavalry, and absolutely slaughtered over 1,000 Tejanos in a battle that couldn't have taken more than 2 or 3 hours. They had them in a sort of a valley out in the open. They opened up their artillery. They went through them with infantry, cavalry riding through them. These boys, the Tejano boys, were completely exhausted by even when the battle started. So they were slaughtered. And after he killed those Tejanos on the field of the Battle of Medina, then he marched into San Antonio and pursued any of them that were trying to escape. He caught most of them, 200 or 300 of them, and in San Antonio, and every morning he would execute. He took all the women and children of San Antonio, put them in a stockade, and made them feed his army and wash their clothes and everything else. And they suffered all kinds of, the women and children suffered all kinds of other abuses. Meanwhile, every morning, Arredondo was slaughtering the Tejano prisoners that he had. Remember that, no prisoners. The Spanish, the Muslim way, behead, no prisoners.
No quarter.
A few of them escaped all the way to Nacogdoches. Arredondo sent, and by the way, Santa Anna was one of Arredondo's lieutenants. And he was watching and learning all of this. This is how you deal with prisoners. They then pursue the very few prisoners that escape all the way to Nacogdoches, they execute them. So every Tejano in the Battle of Medina, and I want to tell you something, there's never been a battle in Texas anywhere near as important. Certainly not the first for democracy, or as large as the Battle of Medina. John, where's the Battle of Medina? You don't know. We don't know. Now you know where the Alamo is.
Mm-hmm.
You've been to that shrine. You've never been to the shrine for the biggest, bloodiest battle for democracy in Texas, because Texas has never cared to know where it happened, when it happened, who did it, why. And you want to cry about 188 Texans in the Alamo? Mm-hmm. Good. You need to. They died. They're heroes. Fine. What about the 1,000 that died at Medina in 1813 for the same cause? So, democracy, independence, revolution, that's Tejano. And it's long before David Crockett, William Travis, and Jim Bowie.
Right. We are filming at the Alamo on Wednesday. So I have a permit to film at the Alamo and also to go into the, into the plaza. But a presentation that you gave, and I've watched many of your presentations because I always pick up a little something more and watch it again. And your presentation started with a lot of questions that I wrote down, but I think it's good. I just wanted a brief comment on there. But what is the identity of the Alamo? What is the narrative? What does it represent? Is the narrative memory or is it history? Who are the first Texans? My application to film at the Alamo was kind of based on those things. Why do you want to film? And I use that. I said I've read many books and I've synthesized all this information. And what I always like to do is I told you about writing the little chapters for the class and stuff like that is to kind of figure out where the tension is. Jim has always told me he's been in 30 feature films. As a videographer, there's just like this tension. I grew up with the Alamo mythology. I'm 62 years old, so I love that mythology. I later became a historian. So I have a very, very different perspectives on all that, but I think those are just fantastic kind of questions that you're asking. I mean, they're very thought-provoking. Well, I don't know, who are the first Texans? Who should we look at? And so what I want to do is, film at the Alamo and give my speech, to get the documentary going, like with it. Why does somebody look at it as these men died, they gave their life for liberty? So liberty for what? Is slavery part of that story? I mean, does that need to be included? Do we deal with the indigenous people? The curator at the Alamo says that the story needs to be much bigger. We need to have more voices. I have some Native Americans that I'm talking to. And another thing that you talked about was very interesting, which I knew about the UNESCO focusing on, from 1718. And I remember you saying, it made me laugh, you said, somebody do the math here. Why are we focusing in 1836 when we should be focusing, if you're going to win the award for, these world UNESCO sites, you got to look at all the missions.
2018 minus 1836, the Battle of the Alamo, doesn't equal 300 years.
Exactly.
So you want to celebrate the 300 years of the Alamo, 1718. You need to, the math doesn't make it. So you got to go back to 1718.
Absolutely. So what kind of advice would you give me, based on some of these questions? I mean, I've been, there's a big part, I have not been to the Alamo. I will be there on Wednesday, although I hear it's going to rain a little bit. But, what am I filming? What am I looking? What is my history? And some people are incredibly, outspoken, very polarized, as I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but very polarized here. So it's one of those things kind of moving forward. I've been asking my questions, and one of the questions that's kind of interesting based on what I said, is the 1836 project designed to negate civilizations that predated Anglos in Texas? I know a lot of people are, Professor Raul Ramos in the University of Houston, very upset with why do we start with 1836? What's the purpose? Like you said, we could go back to 1718. We could look at the indigenous civilizations. Is this something political to negate people that preceded the whites in the creation myth here? Why start in 1836?
Why? Because of the principles that I mentioned a while ago, that when the Europeans came over to what they called the New World, they had this concept that they were the only important people, the only important humans, the only important religion, the only important government, and that anybody before them didn't matter. That's why only 1836, because the people before 1836 with that point of view didn't matter. But the fact of the matter is that Texas is becoming Hispanic today.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're going to study how did Texas become what it is today, if it's over 50% Hispanic, you better study the Hispanic. That's just logic. Otherwise, it's not the history of Texas.
But is that also something that you said, correct me if I'm wrong, I might be on here, that if you're going to talk about the indigenous population, you have the indigenous population buried in the Alamo, Or if we're going to talk about Tejanos, we have to bring up racism, we have to talk about slavery, we have to ground it in a particular. If you incorporate those people and you're incorporating their histories, racism and slavery and bigotry and other things are going to be incorporated, right? Is that, I think that, Frank was talking about there's a fear factor that if you start incorporating the voices, that there's going to be trouble of the white leadership in here.
There is. Brian Burrow and Chris Tomlinson.
Forget the Alamo?
Yeah, that wrote, exactly. They pointed out, as Brian says, that these brave Texans are such little sissies, they can't afford to let anybody talk about their heritage. They're so sensitive about these things. And they are. The term slavery, the concept of slavery. They are, but what I would like to point out is that what all of this is focusing on, without really articulating it, is that everything you're talking about has to do with memory. It has to do with the public concept that many Texans have internalized to the point that they identify very strongly and emotionally, almost spiritually, with this story of Texas that is based on what we call memory. W. Fitzhugh Brundage and others have begun to develop this concept of memory and bringing out a story that you think is the history of Texas, but is based more on stories that you heard. It's not based on fact. It's not based on the census records, the tax records. It's not based on the court records. It's not based on historical documents. It's based instead on what Grandpa told you. It's based on the movie you saw of John Wayne. It's based on the names of the public buildings. It's based on the names of the streets, the rivers. It's based on tales and myths. And so you develop, and by going to school in Austin, Texas, for example, if you're going to go to high school, you're going to go to Austin High School, Crockett High School, Bowie High School, Travis High School. You're going to go to the schools, and after a while you begin to think, who are the Texans? Well, it's Austin, Travis, Bowie, Crockett, etc. There's no Navarro. There's no Seguin. There's no Arciniega. And so by the time you get through high school, Texan to you is somebody that has one of these Anglo-American names. That's memory. And that's what many Texans have been brought up with. And once they're brought up with it, they identify with it spiritually even. So if you have an Anglo-American name, especially if you have a name like Austin or Crockett or Travis, it's very easy to begin to think we're the ones that gave Texas and made Texas and we're the true Texans. But the fact of the matter is history tells a completely different story. So you have to understand that, to understand the deep attachment. And then also you add this, we were talking earlier about manifest destiny, that it was the Anglo-American who called themselves Anglo-Saxons. It was the Anglo-Saxons who brought democracy and Christianity and all of these other good things to Texas and to the western part of the United States. If you add that over the racial identification that Texans have, then a person can begin to think, we really are the ones who brought Texas, and we really are the good part of Texas. And then you either silence, as Rolf Trujillo said, you can silence history as well. If you silence the Tejano contributions, if you silence the fact that the Tejanos really established and fought for and died and bled for democracy before the Anglo-Americans, you silence all of that part. Then it becomes easier to begin to demonize Santa Anna, demonize the Mexican, and say they slaughtered our people. And you forget the fact that the Anglo-Americans slaughtered the Mexican soldiers at San Jacinto. And you silence that. and you bring out only the part that Santa Anna slaughtered the Mexicans at the Alamo. It's pretty easy to then embellish that and develop that as a full story, and that's what happened. So you have the Alamo, that the only thing that's important about it is 1836.
Right. Yeah. I was telling Frank that I reached out to Richard Slotkin in his trilogy and was going to interview him, and he's got a son that is susceptible to getting sick with COVID and stuff, so we might have to do this long distance. But when I was trying to bring everything together, connect all the dots, I said, in a certain way, I was teaching my students, I was joking, I said, I'll save you the 400 pages in Regeneration Through Violence, that white people regenerate themselves through first slaughtering the environment and then slaughtering people of color. That's what I said. And I mean, it was kind of looking at, but this kind of idea where it's, I mean, Slotkin says even more than the people, you know, whatever gets in your way, if it's the trees or it's the mountains or
Yeah,
it's
the
the
trees,
idea,
absolutely.
you bring.
A clear example of that is that in the old American paintings, the classic American paintings, every painting has to have a tree stump in it. Because they want to slaughter nature first.
Right,
And
then you slaughter the
Right,
people.
I'm sorry.
But no, that just was the way, in a certain sense, we could get the, you know, how do you connect 1821 with some of the things that are happening today? You know, what's that? And when I talked about Trump giving this commencement a naval academy or something, you know, like that, we will not apologize for conquering the, you know, this environment, for creating a civilization. I mean, the words that he was saying, you could hearken back to, you know, we were like Stephen F. Austin saying, when I came to Texas, I found a howling desert. What we did was we made this a Garden of Eden. We made it thrive. I would say the same thing, which is always controversial, but Israel does the same thing to Palestinians. You know, Israelis made the desert bloom. It's Israelis, not Palestinians. We're talking about co-opting things. Israel would have you believe also that hummus comes from them, which is, you know, everywhere. You know, you buy hummus, or it's Palestinian, you know. But this kind of idea of stealing the kind of appropriating and taking.
You reverse it and you appropriate.
You appropriate and say, hey, this is our thing, you know, stuff. So that's interesting. I have just a couple of things, and I think these are from Raul Ramos that I think might be important. It says, along what we talked about, by originating the Alamo story in 1836 with the birth of the Texas Revolution, have Anglo-Americans cast previous and existing people to an indeterminate past, rendering all Mexican origin people as foreign outsiders, in essence effectively erasing and marginalizing Mexicans and indigenous from the past and the present. So it goes along with it, you know, choosing that date, you know, 1836. And I think one of the things that I remember, it got me thinking, it was talking about these people that came into Texas as naturalized Mexicans, as you know, and many illegals coming across the border. He was talking about when you talk about Texas
From the United States.
Yeah, from the United States. Yes. So that was his thoughts, and he also wrote about this. It says the Alamo's history and myth belong to a war that was inspired in part by the drive for slavery and a belief in the superiority of whites. Is the Alamo where the campaign of Southern slavery and Native American genocide migrated west and expressed itself in the demonization of Mexicans? The myth of the Alamo and the definition of belonging has largely excluded Mexicans.
Excuse me. Over here. The other side of the fence. I'm trying to record some sound. Is it possible you can work on the other side of the house for an hour or something?
Just 10 minutes will be fine, Jim. Tell them we're recording.
You guys want to take a 10-minute break?
Yeah, we're recording sound. We're doing a little interview here. I'm terrific. Thank you. Appreciate it.
He's going to pause?
Yeah, he knows who you are.
We're going to need only 10 more minutes. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
So
That's amazing. I never heard of that.
I usually have in Hollywood it's $50 delivery every day. You
Mm.
just walk around with $50 bills.
So I'll read the question again.
Well, I got the question unless you want to get it on record.
Okay, I'll say yeah, because I think the Alamo's history and myth belong to a war that was inspired in part by the drive for slavery and a belief in the superiority of whites. Is the Alamo where the campaign of Southern slavery and Native American genocide migrated west and expressed itself in the demonization of Mexicans? The myth of the Alamo and the definition of belonging has largely excluded Mexicans. Your thoughts on that?
I don't think that Anglo-Americans were driven by slavery. Certainly they wanted to protect slavery. They needed slavery because that's how they got rich. You know, your people in Jamestown that you were talking about in the American Revolution, America got rich on tobacco. America got rich on cotton. And a big part of the wealth that they got through cotton was because they didn't have to pay labor. Which is it's the story of America. We try to get undocumented workers to come in, and then we claim that they're violating the laws when we're the ones that recruit them and hire them just so we can take advantage of the cheap labor. Well, that was a big drive, definitely. Slavery was a big drive. But it's not the reason that they came. It's not the reason that they took over Texas. Certainly it was a major drive. I wouldn't say that they came for Texas. They came for free land. They came for a government that Stephen F. Austin. Yes, Stephen F. Austin admitted that slavery was sine qua non to Anglo-American wealth and success here in Texas, the first Anglo-Americans who settled in Texas. He stated that very clearly. He stated that to the Mexican government. He stated in all of his papers. That's true. But they were driven, and he himself said it, by the land and the most munificent form of government that he had ever seen. That's what drew them. That's what, instead of going to Missouri, Moses Austin turned 90 degrees south. That's what literally turned the American frontier from a westward movement, 90 degrees, it turned them into Texas. And they didn't leave here until they took Texas and held it. Then they went on to Montana, Wyoming, California, whatever. So to answer your question, slavery was a major factor, but they didn't come for slavery. They came for the wealth that they could get, the free land, the good government that didn't tax them, that gave them homestead laws and everything else. Now, along with that, then you have all of these other tenets of racial superiority and everything else that justifies in what they call the Texas Revolution. It justifies then not only overthrowing the Mexican form of government but the Mexican leaders in the government, marginalizing the Mexican leaders of government. So it becomes in a completely Anglo-American government, the Republic of Texas, and then later the state of Texas becomes a completely Anglo-American government. Yeah, slavery was important, but it wasn't what drove them.
Right.
And now, again, don't get me wrong, they definitely needed more Southern senators, slave state senators, to equal the number of non-slave senators in the U.S. Senate. They definitely, and they saw that Texas, Missouri, and other lands that they could take over would add to the U.S. Senate once they became senators. That's true.
Right, right. I want to ask you, buy me a little time here. As I told you in your case, 414, I read that many times through, where you talked basically about your findings. Can you just give us a little background how that case, your 82-page report came about? What was the purpose of it? How did you put that together?
I was asked to be an expert witness for that court case. And the court's request was that I provide evidence, documentary evidence, that Hispanics, Latinx, Mexican Americans, Tejanos, had been denied basic principles of American democracy, the freedom to participate in all of the privileges of American democracy, that is, voting, elections, but it also presupposes that these people would have equality that would give them the same access to democracy. And that equality involves equality in housing, because education, because of the independent school district system that we have, education is based on where you live. And if you're kept in a neighborhood that doesn't have good schools, or if you're privileged and allowed to go to the best schools, and that is done racially, then the people who are not allowed to go to the best schools are not going to have the education. Second, if you base employment and wages and promotion and rank on education and skills, then what you're doing is you're taking that educational segregation and extending it to employment and also wage level and also lifestyle and living standards. So you segregate the education, segregate the employment, and then segregate housing, and then you begin to segregate and have different treatment on the basis of law enforcement, that you start racially profiling people. You accept this notion that Mexicans are criminals, drug dealers, cartel members, etc., murderers, whatever. Then law enforcement is not only conditioned to racially profile, but to treat African Americans, Mexican Americans differently from what they would an Anglo-American or somebody that they relate to racially. So when you take in all of these other factors, education, housing, employment, law enforcement, then that is what restricts access to the democratic processes and the freedom to feel that you're not intimidated to go and vote. Now you add above that lynching, bombings of churches, the kind of massacre that you had in El Paso a year or so ago, a few months ago. That is intimidation, and it is very effective. I've always said the best way to keep a person from voting is to lynch his grandfather in a public square where you cook him alive and let everybody in town cheer and celebrate, and then you cut pieces of his body up and sell them as lampshades. He won't vote again. Mm-hmm. Now that's America. Mm-hmm. America is a very effective intimidation. It's very brutal. And it is on a mass scale. And in Texas, my purpose was to show Tejanos were not simply intimidated, they were massacred. And I'm not talking about Alamo and San Jacinto. I'm talking about massive waves in Austin, Texas, where the land grant owners that the streets, the neighborhoods are named after, Del Valle, Menchaca, those people were in one massive 1859 vigilante raid driven out of Austin. So now you have only Anglo-Americans and European immigrants that are becoming the mayors and the businessmen of Austin. That's not an accident. That's by design. They drove the original citizens, U.S. citizens, out of Travis County and Austin. So now you have only poor Mexican Americans. Well, that's by design. Then you have about 10 years, 20 years later, another massive vigilante raid that slaughters, and I'm talking brutal, slitting throats of the great-grandfather patriarch of a 300-member family in Victoria, Texas, and doing that to hundreds of people, even thousands, in a period of about 2 weeks. You kill all of them, and then you move on to their ranches, and the ranches become the biggest, most successful ranches in Texas today. Then the next year you do it in Corpus Christi, and you kill every Mexican-American citizen from Corpus Christi down to Edinburgh, and you take over those ranches, El Paisle and El Peñascal, and all the big Spanish El Rancho Grande, and it becomes the King Ranch, the Kennedy Ranch. All of the famous ranches that brag to be the biggest ranches in the world, the biggest farm in the world, the biggest family-owned, oil-produced, that's on Tejano land. And many of those Tejanos were slaughtered. Mm-hmm. Then you keep doing it on down to the Yorktown area in Texas, and you take large families, extended families of 300, you kill every one of them in one night. And people living on that land today do not want you to talk about anything that deals with the violence in Texas, because they're living on those lands in wealth today. Would you want people to tell? I'll ask you this. Ask them to show you the land title. Ask them to show you the deed of transfer that hasn't been sanitized. Ask them to show you that. Those who can will show you a land title that says that Juana Martinez sold 20,000 acres to John Smith for $1, knowing everything she was doing with full cognizance of what she was doing, the widow, Juana Martinez, and signed with an X. Did she know what she was reading and writing and signing? And why is she a widow? And why does she sell 20,000 acres for $1? That is the history of Texas. Would you want people telling that story? Now you want to talk about silencing history. It's not just the Tejano enchiladas and rope and boots and saddles and spurs and everything else that we all live today. A Texan today is nothing but a Mexican with pink skin. They just adopted lock, stock, and barrel the Mexican way of life. Texas, without the Mexican culture, is Ohio. Even the Texas Rangers are nothing but a copy of the Compañía Volante that the Mexicans had. So, would you want people telling that? Or would you want to silence the Tejano and silence the brutality and violence and then raise this memory that kids are brought up with from the time they're 6 years old? That is gratifying to them, but it's gratifying to them at the expense of the true Tejanos. Now, you want a real Tejano? Native Americans were not exterminated. They live on 410, Loop 410 South in San Antonio today. Thousands of them, thousands of families, direct descendants of the people before the Spaniards live on Loop 410 South in San Antonio today, Nacogdoches, Victoria, Goliad, El Paso. They're here today. Now their story is written in pictographs, thanks to Carolyn Boyd, on the White Shaman. They had a religion. They knew astronomy. And they left it in pictographs. And those are the people that were the residents of the Alamo. You want to talk Alamo? Who built it? Those natives who were here before the Spaniards. Who lived in it? The natives who were here before the Spaniards.
Who died in it?
Who died, who went to church? Who fought in the Battle of the Alamo? Those same natives. They fought for Texas. Now, who's a Texan? A guy who comes in from Tennessee for 2 months? Not even 2 months. And you name a high school after him? Or the guy whose family's been here for 12,000 years and fought and died right next to David Crockett? Who's the Texan? And who do we call a Texan? Do you call Seguin a Texan? Do you call these natives who lived in the... You don't even know the history of the natives in the Alamo. You just know the history of the people who came and died in the Alamo, but you don't know the history of the people who built it and then died along with them. You don't know their names. There's no shrine after them. There's no temple.
Not on
You
the
never learn
cenotaph
them.
or...
You won't know their name. And they're not Texans. They're Mexicans. Murderers, drug dealers.
Rapist.
That's who they are. Now, if you're brought up in this, what are you going to feel? You're going to feel that you're the true Texan and they are immigrants. I was born in Texas, and in my professional career, I have been called an immigrant by all sorts of friends of mine who just naturally see me as an immigrant. And I'm talking modern day today. They don't see me as an American citizen. If an issue of immigration comes up today, we'll say, Andres, what do you immigrants think about this? And I think, hold it. Didn't your parents come in and work at Motorola from Ireland to work at Motorola last year? Yeah. Who's the immigrant? But they see that their kids go to UT. They go to Columbia. And they become Americans. Their kids become Americans. Professionals. CPAs, lawyers, etc. While the Tejano, the real Texan, can't even get into UT. Can't even graduate from high school. So, to me, Texan is not only who's the real Texan, but what story are we being told? And I don't blame them for believing it. I'm not angry at my friend who said, I learned all the Texas history I needed in the first grade. I'm not angry at him. I understand him His history's been silenced, just like mine.
Yeah. I have to tell you, come on like a firestorm at the end. I've just really moved. I felt like a student in a history class. I have one, I think, last thing that I wanted to ask you. When I was writing my article, I wanted to kind of come with a force at the very end. So this is you. I have it in quotations of here, but it's something that kind of brought everything together for me.
Jim, would you ask Juanita to bring me a bottle of water or tea? Thanks.
So the summary of my findings of discrimination against Latinos in Texas is that discrimination has been pervasive and a constant phenomenon since 1836, when Anglo-Americans took control of Texas government. Anglo-American government control was expanded by the defeat of Mexico in the U.S.-Mexico War of 1846 to 48, which ended in the taking of present-day South Texas as well. The traumatic manner in which those Mexicans became U.S. citizens through defeat placed them at a greater disadvantage in knowledge and access to the laws, economic power, and government. Another theme in my conclusion is that racist and discriminatory treatment has been a major characteristic and consistent thread in relationship between Latinos and Anglo-Americans, especially in Texas. Another theme is that Anglo-Americans have consistently used Texas government agencies, police agencies, and laws to appropriate lands, labor, and cultural heritage from Latinos. You still remain firm in your
Absolutely.
summary.
Absolutely. When the governor of Texas recruits veterans from the Spanish-American War in the Philippines, where the American soldiers were slaughtering Filipino Muslims, burying them in a pit with the bodies of hogs, specifically to aggravate this offense on the Muslim religion, committing wholesale atrocities and mutilation of the Filipino population. At the end of that war, the Texas governor specifically recruits those veterans to be Texas Rangers, and he says he wants them. Now those boys, you talk about PTSD, that's who's recruiting to become Texas Rangers. And when he's asked, why do you want them? He said, because those are men who know how to handle a Mexican. He sends them down to South Texas, where lawyers and land developers are waiting in Edinburgh, Corpus Christi, San Diego, Alice, Texas, etc., where the lands are owned, the large land grants are still owned by Mexican-American U.S. citizens, and I'm talking 1915, I'm not talking 1700, 16, I'm talking 1915.
Like La Matanza period.
Exactly.
Porvenir a couple years later, 1918.
Exactly. The Texas Ranger goes into a little town, Encino, Texas, Alice, Texas, goes to the jail and tells the sheriff, I want your Mexican prisoners. Well, there's no Mexicans, they're all Mexican-American citizens in the jail. The sheriff hands him over 5 people. He handcuffs them with their hand behind their back, puts them on their knee, walks behind each one of them and puts a slug in the back of their head. And he goes to the next town and does that. Now he went to the jail, but in Edinburgh, in the larger cities, where you have these large names, Cavazos and Hinojosa and Bayi and all the large land grants, we're talking 200,000 acre land grants, that have not sold and refuse to sell, because they still have this concept that land is with the family, you don't sell it. And the sheriff's been after them to sell it. The land developers have been offering all kinds of money, and lawyers have been offering big money, and they refuse to sell. The Texas Ranger goes to the land lawyer and the land developer in 1915 in Edinburgh, Texas, and says, give me the names of the people, the Mexicans you need. The land lawyers and land developers give them what they called in sworn testimony 1919 in the Canales hearings here in the state capitol at the land office. Sworn testimony by the Rangers saying, we call that the blacklist, and the lawyers gave it to us. So what did you do with the blacklist? He said, the Ranger says, well, they had a couple of weeks to leave town, and what would happen if they didn't? The Ranger says, well, they just evaporated. Excuse me, sir, What do you mean by evaporated? In other words, not a sign left, no dust, no fingerprints, no body. They just evaporate. Blacklist, evaporate, and those are the biggest lands and the wealthiest citizens of Texas, some of them, whose lands are taken. Each one of those has 300 people in an extended family, a patriarch, a matriarch, uncles and aunts and all the kids, 3 or 4, even 5 generations. And those then become the landless Mexican-American migrants of the Golden Great Valley of Texas. So, yeah, it was the government. And these slaughters that I told you that took place in Victoria, Corpus Christi, where they go through vigilante raids, where they, El Porvenir, that's Texas Rangers that kill those people, pull all the men out of the village and just mow them down, slaughter them in front of their families.
15.
That's Texas Rangers and U.S. Army. The bullets that have been found are Texas Rangers and bullets Army, and U.S. Army bullets. That's the Salt War. That's Porvenir. That's the Peñascal raid. That's all the raids. The raid here in Texas, in Austin, was led by the chief of police. He's boasting in the newspaper that he just drove all the Mexicans out. That's why he's a popular, and he's a big Texas figure. So, who killed the U.S. citizens who own land and were killed only because they're Hispanic? A sheriff, a National Guard militia, the U.S. Army, the Texas Rangers. Now, I'm not saying that all Texas Rangers are bad. Tejanos depended on the Texas Rangers because there were cattle rustlers, Mexican cattle rustlers, Anglo, and they loved and respected the Texas Rangers. But there were a few Texas Rangers. I don't know, I guess it's like they say about cops.
There's a couple.
A few. Now you tell me, and you're going to have to tell me, because I'm a historian, I deal only in the past. Is it systemic? Or is it a few bad apples? You tell me. Now, whether or not the 1836 project